At the scene of a firefighter dug a hole and suddenly felt an invisible force yank his axe. He struggled to break free, but the force pulled him and his axe tightly to the ground. It felt as if something terrifying in the hole was attacking him. However, after a brief struggle, he stood up as if nothing had happened. Back at the fire station, things started to change. He couldn't control his appetite and began binge eating, consuming everything in the fridge without feeling satisfied. His colleagues, alarmed by his ravenous behavior, handed him a can of beer. But as soon as he took a sip, he spat it out and clutched his stomach in discomfort. He rushed to the bathroom, trying to vomit but couldn't. Feeling hot and restless, he headed to the shower. Suddenly, his scalp became unbearably itchy. He scratched so hard that he started to bleed but couldn't stop. After finishing, he looked in the mirror and saw that his forehead was ulcerated and his eyes were bloodshot with a strange, eerie look. Strangely, he felt no pain. When he saw a picture of his ex-girlfriend, he hastily dressed and left, barely pulling up his pants. The only thought on his mind was to find his ex-girlfriend. He drove to the ice rink and spotted her among the crowd. He staggered across the ice, straight towards her. Seeing him, she eagerly left the stands and met him in the locker room. It wasn't until then that her current boyfriend, Scott, noticed she was missing from her seat. The ex-girlfriend, unaware of the impending danger, went along with her ex's urgency. As they entered the locker room, the firefighter opened his mouth and a horrifying parasite crawled out, burrowing into the woman's navel. She didn't notice anything wrong and, seeing her ex collapse on the floor, left angrily after mocking him. As she exited, she bumped into Scott, who had come looking for her. Scott, sensing something was off, checked the locker room and found evidence, a firefighter's badge. Unbeknownst to him, the firefighter, now free of the parasite, had died horribly in the stairwell. Scott couldn't help but confront his girlfriend with the badge. Faced with the evidence, she confessed but lied, claiming the firefighter had harassed her and that nothing happened between them. Although Scott was still angry, he couldn't resist her kiss and chose to forgive her. They agreed to meet later that night, and she went home. But like the firefighter, she began to feel extreme hunger, and her body started to show signs of ulceration. That evening, Scott arrived at his girlfriend's house as planned. He rang the doorbell, but there was no answer. He called her phone, but there was no response. Frustrated and ready to leave, he suddenly saw his girlfriend heavily made up, leaving the house. Scott decided not to confront her, but to quietly follow and see what she was up to this time. Scott trailed her to a bar, and what he saw made his blood boil. She quickly picked out a stranger, and within 5 seconds of meeting, they disappeared into the restroom together. Scott peered through the crack in the door and was infuriated by the disgraceful scene unfolding inside. He had known his girlfriend to be wild, but not this indiscriminate. Overcome with rage, Scott could no longer contain himself and prepared to burst in and confront her. To his surprise, the man suddenly bolted out of the restroom, clearly alarmed. Scott, ready to demand an explanation from his girlfriend, found her standing motionless, facing the wall. She didn't respond to his calls. Sensing something was terribly wrong, Scott approached her and found her face covered in blood pouring from her mouth. She collapsed and died on the spot. The horrific scene was witnessed by 2 women who, fearing being implicated, ran off, leaving Scott to flee the scene as well. The police quickly arrived, and based on the eyewitnesses' accounts, they identified Scott as the prime suspect. With nowhere else to go, Scott sought refuge at his ex-girlfriend Jesse's house. However, the bloodstains on his clothes drew Jesse's attention. Scott chose to lie, saying he had just had a fight with his girlfriend. Jesse, unsuspecting, agreed to let him stay the night. The next morning, Jesse learned from the news that Scott's girlfriend had died. When she moved to call the police, Scott had to come clean, and she collapsed moments later. He insisted he had nothing to do with her death and suspected she might have been infected with a disease or poisoned due to her blackened eyes and bloodshot look. Scott pleaded with Jesse to give him time to uncover the truth. Just then, the sheriff, who was Jesse's uncle, arrived at the door. Knowing Scott and Jesse's close relationship, he came to investigate. Jesse, trusting Scott, lied about his whereabouts. Scott took the opportunity to escape. However, the observant sheriff found Scott's bloodied clothes in a closet. Though shocked that his niece would lie to him, he was left with no choice but to let it go for the moment. The sheriff's phone rang. It was another call from the police. A store owner had reported a suspicious man behaving erratically at a mall. The man turned out to be the same one who had been with Scott's girlfriend in the restroom the previous night. Clearly, the parasite had moved on to a new host. Stumbling around, the man was frantically searching for his next target. He spotted a woman who had fallen and immediately moved to forcibly take her away. Fortunately, the mall crowd intervened in time to stop him. At that moment, the police arrived. After failed attempts to reason with him, an officer fired his weapon. The sheriff managed to subdue the man long enough to have him taken to the hospital. However, the doctor who emerged from the ambulance was covered in blood, indicating he too had been infected by the parasite. Meanwhile, Scott, piecing everything together, realized that the entire ordeal began because the firefighter and his girlfriend had secretly met. He took the firefighter's badge and headed to the fire station to investigate. Using the badge, he discovered that the firefighter's last call was to a burning church. Scott saw on the news that the man who had attacked his girlfriend was the same one causing chaos at the mall. It became clear that the truth lay in that church. Jesse, watching the news at home, noticed that the eyewitness accounts matched Scott's story perfectly. Convinced that Scott had been truthful, she called him, offering to help uncover the truth. Meeting up, they headed to the burned church together. Inside, they found the hole the firefighter had dug with the axe still stuck in it. Scott pulled the axe out, and Jesse, inspecting it, noticed a strange, vinegar-like smell. Determined, they decided to explore the church's basement. At the hole's edge, Jesse found an ancient envelope containing a letter that described a terrifying insect from hell, sealed in a jar beneath the church. The truth became evident. The firefighter had accidentally broken the seal, releasing the parasite and becoming its first victim. Unfortunately, the letter was severely corroded, making the crucial final details unreadable. They could only discern that the seal had been dated 1871. The missing information likely held the key to stopping the parasite. The only solution now was to investigate what had happened in 1871. But before that, they had to find the man killed at the mall to prevent further disaster. Scott and Jesse headed to the hospital. There, they learned from the staff that the last person in contact with the man's body was a doctor, leading them to suspect that the doctor might now be infected. They decided to split up. Jesse would go to the archives to find information, while Scott would track down the infected doctor. Unbeknownst to them, the doctor, who was skateboarding, had already attacked another girl. When Scott arrived at the scene, the doctor was dead. Learning that the doctor had attacked the girl before collapsing, Scott tried to take her to the hospital. Her friends, however, mistook Scott for a lunatic and knocked him out. When he came to, the police were on the scene, and the sheriff, assuming it was Scott's doing, arrested him and took him to the station. Meanwhile, at the archives, Jesse found a videotape from 1871. It showed a man named Edward, who had also been infected by the parasite. Following this lead, she visited Edward's descendant, an elderly woman. The woman explained that priests had used lightning to extract the parasite from Edward and then sealed it beneath the church. The woman also revealed that the priests had left behind important tools and handed Jesse the key to her basement. Jesse found the priest's tools in the basement, along with an ancient book detailing everything about the parasite. At the same time, Scott was locked in a cell at the police station. Shortly after, another prisoner was brought in. When Scott learned why the man had been arrested, he realized the prisoner was infected. The man bragged about how a beautiful girl had thrown herself at him, only to die mysteriously. Recognizing the signs, Scott shouted for help. When the sheriff arrived, Scott begged to be let out, explaining that the prisoner was infected. Though puzzled, the sheriff handcuffed Scott and opened the cell. Suddenly, the prisoner lunged at the sheriff, vomiting the parasite into him. Horrified, Scott fled the scene. Jesse arrived just as Scott was escaping the police station, with several officers in pursuit. Realizing the danger, Jesse waited until the officers caught up with Scott before intervening. She grabbed a taser from the police car and confronted the situation. Despite Jesse's threatening stance, the sheriff, her uncle, remained obstinate. After a tense standoff, Jesse reluctantly pulled the trigger. The taser's shock caused the sheriff's body to erupt with countless tendrils. The officers were stunned, realizing the taser had exposed the parasite within him. As the sheriff lunged, the officer opened fire, bringing him down. However, the sheriff, now a host to the parasite, was not easily killed and managed to shoot the officer in return. Terrified, Scott and Jesse jumped into the police car. The sheriff, still alive, raised his gun again. In a desperate move, Jesse floored the gas pedal, ramming him. Remarkably resilient, the sheriff rose once more. Scott quickly shifted to reverse, hitting him again. Spotting the leaking gas tank, Scott devised a plan. He found 2 flares in the police car and, as the sheriff struggled to his feet, ignited the vehicle. The flames engulfed the sheriff, and the pair fled as sirens approached. Taking refuge in a nearby diner, they studied the ancient book on the parasite. They learned that hosts, drained of nutrients, were driven to find new victims before dying. Worse, after infecting 6 hosts, the parasite could reproduce. The book revealed the parasite's weaknesses. It feared alcohol and electricity. Realizing fire wouldn't kill it, they rushed back to the scene. At the site, a chubby reporter disguised as a firefighter was trying to get photos of the sheriff's charred body. Suddenly, the sheriff attacked him, a scene witnessed by Scott and Jesse. The police, unaware of the danger, removed the reporter. When they saw him leave in a taxi, Scott and Jesse followed him to a motel. Knowing the parasite's weaknesses, they decided to force it out of the reporter. Scott rented a room and set up their plan, while Jesse, posing as a heartbroken woman, lured the reporter in. The reporter, already showing signs of gluttony, couldn't resist her. Once in the room, Jesse tied him to a chair, making him think she wanted to play a game. As he settled into the chair, Jesse and Scott prepared for their final confrontation. As they stepped outside, the police had already surrounded the building. Among them was a mysterious man who approached them. He revealed himself to be a descendant of the priests who had originally sealed the parasite. He explained that while alcohol could temporarily incapacitate the parasite, it required flames of 1,500 degrees to destroy it completely. With the threat seemingly neutralized, the priest drove away, and Scott and Jesse, having survived the ordeal, rekindled their romance. However, an overlooked and critical problem remained. The parasite had completed 6 cycles of infection and had laid eggs in the reporter's body. When medical personnel entered the reporter's hospital room, she was met with a horrifying sight.